Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I want to talk about this article that was published in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago. At first, when I read the headline, it says, "Let's stop asking why women aren't having children. Ask for once, why aren't men?" I thought it was a feminist rant about men not taking enough responsibility, men not being assertive enough about having children. Of course, when you read that headline at face value, you're like, well, duh, men can't have children. Obviously, that's why they're not having them. But as I read it, I thought she brought up some really interesting points about the fertility crisis in general and some of the different things that are impacting it, but specifically looking at it from a male perspective, which is largely non existent in the conversation around fertility. And this is something she raises in the piece. So she opens it up by talking about how men are largely invisible in the birth rate debate. And she does intersperse some feminist ranting in here. So I don't want to say it's completely devoid of that, because she talks about here how, it's men who are the ones who are pontificating and creating policy ideas for encouraging women to have babies, yet they're also not being talked about with regard to the fertility debate either, or the birth rate debate. So on the one hand, you have people like Elon Musk like imploring women to have more babies, but then there's no real conversation about the fertility crisis from the men's perspective. And she says part of the problem is an absence of data. And of course, she's speaking from the perspective of someone living in the UK. So she says, like many European countries, we don't really have any on male fertility, and without data, we only have half the picture. And reading this, that really struck me, because a lot of the conversations around marriage and children and having families and careers, when you look at it, it very much centers around women. It's around, how women are held back in their careers. It's about like the gender pay gap. It's about how much more work women do inside the home, domestically speaking, compared to men. And there's very little acknowledgement of the conversations that, or acknowledgement of the contributions that men make. So for example, if you talk about the domestic workload, it's always about, well, this is how much extra time women spend doing this many chores, or it's about the mental load women carry. There's never an acknowledgement of the financial aspect that men carry. Like that's never paired with that information. Or if you talk about the gender pay gap, it's always very broad. It's just like women make less than men, but it's never paired with, okay, here's how many hours on average men are working per week compared to women, and here's how many men are in jobs that pay overtime, for example, so they're able to capitalize on that and make more money. Not everyone works a salaried job, and I think people don't understand that. So if you can't compare, a 9 to 5 social media marketing manager, a woman who's in that position, compare that to, a welder who, works 9 to 5, is in a union, and oh, by the way, gets overtime when he works on Saturdays. And so that skews things. So we really only look at data from the female perspective, not from the male perspective. And so I think that's deliberate, because once you start parsing through the data coming from men, it completely dismantles the feminist argument. So it's much easier for them to cherry pick data and isolate it and focus solely on women than it is to talk about men. So she says, we know what is driving the birth rate crisis is not really people having fewer children, but far fewer people becoming parents at all. And this is true. It's not that, I think whatever the replacement is, like 1.6 or something. It's not that people are just having 1.6 kids. It's the women and the mothers and the families who are already planning on having children are still having like their 2 to 3 children. It's just that there's far fewer of them. So there's far fewer people getting married and far fewer people starting families. And so that's what's driving the average down, because you're aggregating it across the population, including people who are deliberately choosing to be childless. So she interviewed a demographer for this piece, and she says he highlighted how unplanned childlessness or involuntary infertility could often be down to simply not being able to find the right partner. And so that's a piece of the puzzle here. So immediately when I opened up this article, that was something I was thinking about. It's like, okay, why aren't men having children? Well, obviously People aren't coupling up like they used to. People aren't getting married like they used to. And as I've talked about in other videos, I think millennial and Gen Z women are to blame for this. They have, especially feminist women, they have unrealistic expectations about what they want in relationships. And even though they talk about wanting equality and partnership and equity, they really don't. They want someone who is going to affirm their own identity within that relationship. So they want someone who's going to affirm their right to be a girl boss, affirm their right to be a career woman, and they're not willing in return to play the role of wife and mother. And so I think a lot of them refer to their husbands as partners, so they want partners, not husbands. But even some do want husbands, but they don't want to play an equitable role in the relationship, which is ironic because they're the ones, screaming from the rooftops they want equity. But when it comes to relationships, they don't want that. And so it goes on to say here, and this is a true statistic, a British woman who reached the age of 28 without children in 2023 had only a 50% chance of becoming a mother. What he didn't ask is this: if most women still want to have children, what is happening to suitable, willing male partners as people enter their late 20s and 30s? So basically, as you get older, the chances of having children drop significantly. And there's a whole host of reasons for that. But this really puts like a timestamp on trying to find the right person to get married to and then starting a family with them. And she interviews another demographer who says that university-educated men are also postponing having children. So it's not just feminist, liberal, college-educated women. It's also university-educated men. And he says evidence from among men and women in relationships shows that a major reason for delaying childbirth is waiting until both people are ready. Men's postponement of childbirth is tied up with the huge economic and social obstacles that women face. So on the one hand, I think people are waiting until they're older in order to feel like they're ready, so that they've accomplished everything they need to accomplish in life in terms of career and finances and feeling established with themselves. So that's part of it. But the other caveat that he notes here is that men are postponing childbirth because of women. And so part of that includes waiting until a female partner was ready or had established her career, had been a major factor, as well as getting on the property ladder. And so it's not just guys who are delaying having children because they want to be established themselves. They're also delaying it because of their spouses or their girlfriends. They aren't having children either because they're waiting for them to feel equally stable in their careers. And anyone who's had children will tell you this. There's no right or wrong time. Like, you're never gonna feel ready. It is what it is. And the fact that people aren't having children and they're using this argument is a major signal of arrested development. So it's a sign that people are really stuck in adolescence and that they're not willing to take the risks and take leaps of faith to grow up. Once you do something, like once you overcome the fear and you start doing things, you realize the thing you feared isn't really as big of a boogeyman as you thought it was. It's like your mind plays tricks on you and you think things are worse than they really are. But I think people tend to hold themselves back because they've created these thoughts in their minds about, and part of this is informed by society as well, but they create thoughts in their minds of, what marriage is like and what having children is like. And the narrative for women has been, it's going to destroy your career, it's going to hold you back, it's going to imprison you, it's going to shackle you. It's all very negative. And so people are delaying, I think, because they fear that, and they don't realize that just once you do it and you overcome that fear, it's really not as bad as people make it seem to be. It also says here that of those who are single, it was about finding someone who you're sure you want to do it with in a dating culture that doesn't always feel conducive to that goal. So part of it is feeling established, but part of it too is finding the right person. So the writer interviews a gentleman named Tom who's in his late 30s, and he raises a really interesting point here. So you've probably heard about the biological clock. This is for women. Like, we can only produce children for a finite period of time in our lives. It's usually, it starts with your first menstrual cycle, so, 13, 14 years old, and goes until you reach menopause, so probably in your mid-40s. So there's a window of time in which you are fertile, and as you age, like the number of eggs you have available in your body, it becomes depleted, and your body gets to a point where it can no longer support, having children. That's why women in their 50s and 60s and 70s don't have children, right? So there is a real biological clock for women, but what he also talks about here is a psychological clock, and I think this is completely ignored and not even talked about. He says you don't have an infinite amount of time to get to know someone well enough to know really in your heart of hearts whether you want to spend the rest of your life raising a child with them. And I think this is true. So when you're early in your 20s, right? Like you have time. Time is on your side. You're still young and fertile, and you have time to meet people. You have time to figure stuff out about yourself. And you might not be settled in your career at that point, but from a family perspective and starting a family and mating, you have time. As you get older, there's like he says here, there's a psychological clock that starts ticking, and all the good ones, at some point you've probably heard this, all the good ones are taken. So you're have slim pickings, and depending on where you are, geographically speaking, there might not be any viable options at all. And then you kind of have to really think to yourself and really be intentional, but not in a bad way. I think intentionalism in dating is good, but when you get older, you have to change your perspective about dating. It's not it's not as carefree as it is in your 20s. It's something you have to think about, especially if you want family, because it does take time to go on dates and meet someone, and then eventually assess, okay, is this person going to be a good spouse and a good parent for our future children, and then move in that direction. But all that takes time. So if you're in your late 20s, so if you're 28, 29 and you're thinking about this, you still have some time. Whereas if you're 36, 37, 38, and especially if you're a woman and you have the biological clock also ticking down, like you don't really have as much time as you think you do. If you start dating and you're 30 or 37-year-old woman, and it takes 3 years of dating and an engagement and marriage, you're not looking at having a child until you're probably 40. And at that point, it's incredibly high risk. And then you might not have one at all. So I think the psychological clock is a really big factor that isn't acknowledged at all. And it affects both men and women. So while the biological clock really affects women exclusively, the psychological clock can also affect men. And it can affect them as well. And just knowing you have to assess people and make sure they're a good fit. And men will tell you horror stories of dating and marriage, and because the court systems, especially here in the United States, are rigged against fathers. There's a strong incentive for men to do their due diligence and make sure a woman is a good quality human being who has good morals, good virtue, and is going to be the wife and mother that they want. Otherwise, she'll take half of everything, he owns, and deprive him of his children. So that's, I think, something that weighs heavily on the male psyche, and it isn't acknowledged at all when conversations come up around the fertility decline. Okay, so the same individual also talks about the economics of it. So while there's the psychological clock, he also says he couldn't afford the housing or childcare needed to raise a child in the city, and moving away would mean being isolated from the community of friends and family that everyone needs when they become a parent. He says increasing labor market precarity means it is harder for men to fulfill social expectations of being able to provide for families. So this is important because while women have been given the freedom and grace to be girl bosses and to be career women and to make motherhood a choice, for men, the traditional expectations that they're going to be a provider have not changed. So while women want to be girl bosses, they want to be financially independent, they also simultaneously still expect men to provide. So it's a real lose-lose for guys, specifically when we're talking about a dating pool filled with liberal women. It's that these women want to do their own thing. They want their freedom, their independence, their own money, yada, yada, yada. But at the same time, they still expect men to contribute. So It's like, okay, they want men to do, half of all the household chores, but they're not necessarily lining up to volunteer 50% of their pay to contribute to household expenses either. There's still this implicit expectation that men are going to be providers, and obviously the economy has changed drastically over the past couple of decades, where a lot of people find themselves working in cities now, and I'm empathetic to it. I totally get it. I'm from a Rust Belt town in upstate New York, and I myself, moved to Washington, D.C. and started my career there. And even now, I live in Texas, and I completely get it. You have to kind of go to where the jobs are. And because of that, a lot of people have established networks in those cities that they now live in. So on the one hand, people have left their communities and the homes they grew up in that would provide the social community and social safety net that would help with raising children. But on the other hand, people have moved to cities, replaced that social safety net potentially with a new one. But so if they wanted to move away to a lower cost of living area, they would lose that safety net that they've created for themselves. So it really is hard. It really is hard for people to make choices around having children, especially when so many young people are concentrated in cities. And while I'm empathetic to this, I'm highly critical of it, because there is affordable housing, especially in the United States. There is affordable housing in a lot of smaller towns and smaller cities in the country. And because of remote work, it's far easier today to get a job and basically import a big city salary and live in a lower cost of living area. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying everyone can do it. All I'm saying is, compared to a decade ago, it's far easier today. I mean, when I started working in Washington, D.C., you had to have a D.C. address in order to get hired anywhere. And that even included unpaid internships. Like, you could not sit in your parents' house in Wisconsin or Iowa or upstate New York and send in resumes to, nonprofits, think tanks, whatever. You couldn't do that in Washington, D.C. You couldn't just send in your resume and expect to get a job. Like, you had to have a DC address, and a lot of times people would hack the system by just using a friend's address and put it on their resume. But that was the expectation just a decade ago. Now, remote work has been so normalized that it's possible. Again, it's not easy necessarily to find remote work. Not every job is going to make it so it's permissible to do that. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. And maybe too, you work in a city for a while, and then you leverage that to go somewhere else. So a good example is I very briefly worked at a bank, a community bank back home, and the manager of the department I worked in, she had previously worked at JP Morgan Chase in New York City. So I don't know how many years she put in there, but she had worked in New York City, lived in New York City, and then moved to upstate New York, about 5 hours away from the city, and had gotten the job at the community bank. So sure, definitely a pay cut from JP Morgan Chase, but she was able to leverage her experience with JP Morgan in order to get a job at a community bank. And while it wasn't necessarily going to be, a one-to-one transfer in terms of salary, like, I think a lot of, if you come with the right pedigree and you have the right skills and the right background, you have a lot more negotiating power than you realize. So no, you're not necessarily going to get a big city salary working in a small town, but you're going to get a big enough salary or sufficient salary to cover the cost of living of that small town. And it's going to be significantly cheaper. I mean, the community bank that I worked at regularly services mortgages on homes ranging from, $60,000 to, $1 million, right? So when you live in small towns, you have like a wider gamut of what you can afford and what you can live in. And so those options do exist. I think people, and this again gets to the arrested development, like, you just have to grow up and make the choice and leave. And I personally don't think that saying, well, housing is too expensive or childcare is too expensive, therefore I'm not going to have kids. I think that is a childish answer. I think men, especially, just because this article is focusing on men, can make the choice and be the leaders, step up, be the leaders in their family, say, hey, we're going to have a family. We can't afford to continue living in Park Slope in Brooklyn. We're going to live here instead. That requires leadership and men stepping up to the plate. So I'm sympathetic. I'm empathetic. However, there are choices out there, and I think people need to acknowledge the choices that are available to them and use those choices to their advantage. Okay, so this piece concludes by saying, on top of economic circumstances, there's been a fundamental shift in how we have come to see having a child. What used to be a cornerstone life event, something that you did as you entered adult life, is now a capstone one, meaning something you do when you've ticked off all those other life goals. And this is kind of what I was saying in the beginning, like having a child now, it's not, everyone puts it off. It's something you wait to do until you do everything else you want to do in life. And then by then it can become too late. You may have waited too long. And so people are putting other things first. So starting a business, getting a particular education, traveling in particular, that's a big one. People are just putting off having children in order to fulfill these other goals. And this is, again, part of the Arrested Development debate. I think, every society has rituals that you complete to transition from childhood to adulthood. So if you think of, tribal communities, there's always like some sort of hunting ritual where a young man has to be tested before elders within his community. And it's usually on like a hunting trip. So when you get your first big game and you have that kill and you've succeeded in that, like that's usually like your transition from, manhood or from boyhood to manhood. And then for women, it's historically been marriage, whether feminists want to admit it or not. It's the transition out of girlhood into womanhood usually culminates in getting married and then obviously having children. And so it's not even just like a cornerstone event. I think feminists in particular like to frame this as, we're putting raising children, having families, getting married, having kids, we're putting that above all these other goals. And it's not necessarily an either or. It's that family has a greater significance for society and individual development than like getting your master's degree. Like getting the master's degree isn't going to provide the same intrinsic value of transitioning you from childhood to adulthood the way that getting married and having a family does. And that's just, just look at historically how societies have used those events and celebrate them and why they're so significant. Like feminists like to say, we should celebrate, people getting their doctorates the same way that we celebrate weddings or like birth announcements. And like, yeah, you can celebrate that, but it's not a one-for-one, like the same thing. There's a reason why historically people celebrate births and they celebrate marriages because that is significant and important for the growth and evolution of society. You getting your master's degree, your doctorate, like cool, that's a great accomplishment. Not something that really benefits society at large. So I think that's why it's otherwise underplayed or undervalued, if you will. Okay, so she says, we need to know more about all the factors influencing male fertility and the birth rate, from modern dating culture to porn to housing, the male mental health crisis, and cannabis use. So she just lists a handful of things. But I do think it's important. Like we don't look like all the conversations are around population collapse, and she is right. Like it focuses on women having more children, and some of the solutions that I've seen and I advocate is you have to change culture to make motherhood cool again. You have to make women want to have children, but there's no real equivalent conversation for guys. And I think that's because, like she said, there's no data, but there's also no acknowledgement. There's no acknowledgement of the difficulties men face in the court system and the risks they take on just by getting married and having kids. I mean, I didn't even know this was a thing until like maybe earlier this year, but like paternity fraud is a thing. I had no idea. Maybe I'm like blissfully ignorant. I had no idea. Like that was a thing, that women would deliberately have children with one man and then go back to their boyfriend, husband, whatever, and claim it was theirs legitimately. And then that guy would be, if something happened or he had to pay child support, they were divorced, whatever, like that man would be responsible under the court of law for another man's biological child. Like, that just blows my mind. And the fact that like paternity testing isn't mandatory, I just assumed like people got tested. Like, wouldn't you want to know like half the genes that are coming into your, like if you're creating a child, like half come from the mom, half come from the dad? Wouldn't you want like a comprehensive picture of like your child's genes and then like potential like complications that could arise? I don't know. It just seems logical to me. I thought too, like wouldn't hospitals test to verify? Like, you hear horror stories all the time of, babies getting swapped at birth and, being misattributed to the wrong family. Like, wouldn't you like test the baby and test the mom and the dad to make sure like everyone belongs? I don't know. I just assumed like these things were happening, and apparently they're not. And like, women are getting away with paternity fraud all the time. And this is, I think Tennessee is trying to push a law to make it, I don't know if they already did, but I've heard conversations about that where they're trying to get a law in the books to make paternity testing mandatory, especially for women claiming benefits and like alimony after divorce and child support and all that kind of stuff. So, and people are like up in arms against this. Like, feminists are like, oh, this is awful. I like stuff like that, like stuff like policies, easy stuff like that, revisiting the court system. Like, you never hear policy proposals about that. No one talks about the consequences of no-fault divorce and, how women are able to game the system. No one talks about paternity fraud. And I say this as a woman. Like, these are conversations that are not coming up in female circles. If anything, I think women might be talking about like how to game the system. They might be like encouraging each other how to game the system, but there's no like intellectual policy conversation about how to solve these two things. And I think that plays a big role because you have to incentivize marriage. Like, your chances of having children greatly increase if you're married. So you need to get men to want to get married. And so part of that is changing the culture. So de-radicalizing women, like getting feminism out and upholding traditional values and traditional gender roles onto a higher pedestal to make it more socially acceptable and desirable, but then also like fixing some of those institutional problems like the court system and like paternity fraud, so that there aren't as many penalties that men can face if they're wronged by a woman, and holding women accountable, right? Like, holding women accountable for their actions. Like, because of how the court system has been structured, like, women are incentivized to basically defraud men, and they're encouraged to do it. And that is something that, until they're held accountable, until you see women start paying child support equitably to men, until you start seeing women imprisoned for committing paternity fraud, like until you start seeing some accountability and some reforms, there's not the incentive, the incentive for men to have relationships with women and get married to them and then start families just isn't there. So I think, you need to talk about that kind of stuff. And then obviously, like, housing, like they were saying here, the mental health crisis, I think, is a big one that is largely ignored. A lot of people are talking about, from feminist perspectives about just general mental health or women, but men are completely ignored. No one's talking about that. She says cannabis use here. I have no idea what this has to do with fertility. If you have any insight into that, like, please tell me. I would just say like cultural vices in general. So anything that could be addictive, right? So maybe that's cannabis, maybe it's alcohol, gambling, sports gambling. Now we're like Polymarket and stuff. You can bet on world events. It's wild. Talk about that kind of stuff too. I think all of that, can affect men's decision to have children. But I think first you have to get a better pool of women who are more desirable and virtuous, and then you have to stop punishing men for the behavior of women. You have to hold women accountable. I think that's a really important part of it. So that's what I got for you today. I would love to know your thoughts on this, like what you think is missing from the conversation about the fertility crisis, specifically as it relates to men. What do you wish, writers like this or people like me would talk more about that isn't being discussed? And if you are a guy, like, how do you think the fertility crisis could be solved from your perspective? How do you think, Western civilization could, whether that's governments, culture, whatever, could start boosting the fertility rates and incentivize couples, not just women, but couples in general, to start having more children? I would love your thoughts on that. Thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this commentary, I'd love it if you would like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.